You've probably seen the meme, the one attributed to the Dalai Lama that reads, "The planet does not need more successful people. The planet desperately needs more peacemakers, healers, restorers, storytellers, and lovers of all kinds." The problem is, while a lovely sentiment, the Dalai Lama did not say this. The Dalai Lama did not write this. So please, stop attributing it to him. Just stop. I'm Nick Mather, and welcome to Rebel Spirit. While it is quite a lovely sentiment, as I said, it is not a quote by the Dalai Lama. It is from David Orr's 1991 essay, "What is Education For?" Now, I've had people get really defensive when I've pointed this out online. Some have even responded with something like, well, the Dalai Lama probably said something like this. Maybe. But as an academic, I know correct attribution matters. It is also important to admit when you're wrong. That said, if anyone can point me in the direction of where the Dalai Lama said this or something very similar to this prior to 1991, then by all means, please let me know. But this is not the main point of this video. The main point of this video is to explore David Orr's essay because that one quote, as important as it is not the entirety of his argument, which I believe deserves a full hearing. But first, a little bit of background on David Orr. He is the Paul Sears Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Politics Emeritus at Oberlin College in Ohio. He also serves as Senior Advisor to Oberlin's President. He is the author of 8 books, including Earth and Mind on Education, Environment, and the Human Prospect, The Last Refuge, Patriotism, Politics, and the Environment in an Age of Terror, and Hope is an Imperative, a collection of his writings. He co-edited 3 other books and authored over 200 articles, reviews, book chapters, and professional publications. He is the founding editor of the journal Solutions. He has also served on the boards of several foundations or acted in an advisory capacity to them, including the Rocky Mountain Institute and the Aldo Leopold Foundation. In his essay, Orr lists 6 myths of education, followed by 6 principles he believes should guide education. He frames all of this in the context of our ongoing ecological crisis and climate emergency. As he argues, the value of education must now be measured against the standards of decency and human survival. So let's first look at what he identifies as the 6 myths of education. Myth number 1, ignorance is a solvable problem. We humans like to think that one day we'll know everything. We won't. There is always going to be something we don't know. In fact, I'd argue that the more we do learn, the more we know, the more we will realize what we don't know. As I've heard it explained before, the brighter the campfire, the more darkness that is exposed. Also, I think connected to this is that human beings just suck at predicting consequences. We can only make educated guesses, and when dealing with some human activities, we can make good predictions based on previous behavior, but when implementing new technologies, we don't have the past experience to rely on. We don't know what the consequences will be. My favorite example of this is the automobile. When cars were first introduced, they were considered advantageous to the environment. After all, before the car, people got around largely on horses, which leave quite a mess. According to the New York Historical Society, in the late 1890s, Nearly 500 tons of horse manure was collected daily from the streets of New York City. Still, probably less than the amount of horse shit that is still generated daily in DC. Am I right? Now, I've seen pictures of New York from this time when streets were buried beneath inches of manure like snowdrifts of poop. And don't forget the millions of gallons of urine that were added daily to all of this too. All of this waste certainly did not fill the air with the fragrance of a million flowers, not to mention the health hazard it caused by attracting flies and other insects. The introduction of the horseless carriage was seen as an environmental savior. But then fast forward 70 years and major cities are choking on poisonous smog. For example, there were days in Los Angeles when the air quality was so bad, people were told to stay inside. And of course, we can't ignore how our love affair with cars has contributed to the current climate emergency. So we solved one problem only to create another. We didn't know what the consequences would be. How could we? Ignorance is not a solvable problem. Myth number 2. With enough knowledge and technology, we can manage planet Earth. This seems to me to be connected to the previous myth. We cannot manage what we don't fully understand. There is still so much we do not know about how ecosystems work, the climate, environmental feedbacks, and more. I'm not saying that we don't know anything, but there is much we do not know. Yet you will hear people say all the time that we'll be able to solve the climate crisis with some future technological fix. You sure about that? We have no idea if these currently non-existing solutions would work, how long it would take to develop them, and most importantly, what the long-term environmental impact might be. The idea that we can manage the Earth seems to be more grounded in human hubris and wishful thinking than reality. Instead of managing the Earth, Orr suggests, we turn our focus onto what we can manage, ourselves. We can manage our seemingly insatiable desires for more, for newer, for better. We can manage human creations, not creation itself. We can manage our economies. We can manage our political systems. We can manage the communities where we live. We can manage our values. We can manage the kind of people we want to be. We can manage how we live in the world. Everything else is a diversion from what Thomas Berry called the great work, the work of transforming ourselves to live well in the world. As Orr notes, it makes far better sense to reshape ourselves to fit a finite planet than to attempt to reshape the planet to fit our infinite wants. The third myth is that knowledge is increasing, and by implication, so is human goodness. I think the source of this myth extends back to the philosopher Plato, who held that pure knowledge was knowledge of the good, an absolute, unchanging, eternal, transcendent form of goodness. For Plato, pure knowledge entailed knowing the good, and to know the good was to be good. While we are gaining knowledge, we are also drowning in an ocean of information and data, and many seem to lack the ability to discern what is true. And yet, many also seem to be driven to act on their beliefs. And belief is not knowledge. For Plato, it was akin to shadows on a cave wall. So, grounded in ignorance rather than knowledge, our actions clearly are not of the good. Socrates said that evil is the result of ignorance. We have a serious lack of wisdom and basic critical thinking skills. We live in a post-truth world, which is an epistemological nightmare. What is needed is the ability to discern belief from knowledge and a healthy dose of epistemological humility. We are also losing knowledge. This has been going on for a long time and works hand in hand with colonization and industrialization. As societies and cultures are forced into Western models of development, Traditional ecological knowledge is often lost. We should honor and preserve indigenous knowledge rather than allow it to be lost in the name of progress. Orr also argues that specialization in academic departments does not help. Academic disciplines are often seen as being isolated from all other disciplines, and I guarantee you that students will complain endlessly about being forced to take courses in disciplines other than their majors because they've been trained for 12 years before entering college to not really recognize the interconnected nature of all knowledge. Education should be interdisciplinary, STEAM, not STEM. And how do I get an H in there for the humanities and another E for ecology? And, I don't understand why academic institutions have such a happy for acronyms. Education shouldn't be driven by what can be made into a catchy acronym. We need an entire alphabet of learning. The problem is persistent. When someone gets a PhD, they are supposed to be an expert in a specific field. Their knowledge is deep, for sure, but often incredibly narrow. Now, not everyone who gets their doctorate fits this category. I'll use myself as an example. I'm more of a generalist. If you look at my transcripts, my education is all over the map. My knowledge may not be incredibly deep, but it is broad. But yet, hiring committees time and time again will reject generalization in favor of specialization. Orr also notes that what drives course offerings is often what is currently fashionable. He cites conservation biologist David Ehrenfeld, who observed that biology departments no longer hire faculty to teach in areas such as systematics, taxonomy, or ornithology, and instead overemphasize areas like molecular biology and genetic engineering. And why do they do this? Because molecular biology and genetic engineering are lucrative. Yet we are losing important knowledge because of the focus on what brings in money or what can get students higher paying jobs. But these areas are not any more important than other areas of inquiry. We also lack knowledge of the places we inhabit. Okay, so you may know where the closest Starbucks is, but how many species of trees can you identify in your neighborhood? If you are lucky enough to live someplace with trees, that is. How many bird species share your skies? How many wild plants? Can you identify what that weed is that is growing through the cracks in the sidewalk? How many animals share the space where you live? What insects? What do you really know about that land upon which you live? Where does your water come from? Where does your waste go? What is the history of the land upon where you live? Who were the indigenous people that lived there? What name did they give it? How did they live on the land? Also, to go back to knowledge and goodness for a moment, it is clear we need the wisdom to discern whether knowledge should be used. The development of the atomic bomb is the best example of this. Oppenheimer would later express regret in his role in developing atomic weapons. Although he wasn't involved with the Manhattan Project, Albert Einstein supported it, a position he later regretted. The point is, technology and knowledge are not value-free, and neither is inherently good. The fourth myth that Orr identifies is that we can adequately restore that which we have dismantled. Now, Orr connects this again with fragmented academic disciplines. He notes that most students graduate without any broad or integrated knowledge of how things are interconnected. So, for example, someone who gets a degree in economics or an MBA but lacks knowledge of ecology will never include environmental costs in their calculations. When pricing products, the cost of air pollution, the cost of the consequences of climate change, the cost involved in soil degradation, the cost of toxins dumped into waterways are never considered. The price is illusory. As Orr notes, we fooled ourselves into thinking that we are much richer than we actually are. I would also add that we cannot restore the species that have gone extinct due to human activity. It has been argued that we are currently in the largest mass extinction event since the days of the dinosaurs. According to the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Red List, which is the most comprehensive list of biodiversity loss that there is, over 40,000 species are currently threatened with extinction. 41% of amphibians. 1/4 of all mammal species. Let me repeat that. 1/4 of all mammals. And we're mammals. This should concern us. 1/3 of coral reefs, 1/3 of conifers are all threatened. The Amazonian rainforest, which has been called the lungs of the earth, is nearing a tipping point where it will become a grassy savanna, and I'm pretty sure this is not of the good. None of these species can be restored once they are extinct, and it would be impossible to restore the rainforest to its original health in our lifetimes, or maybe ever. Myth number 5. The purpose of education is that of giving you the means of upward mobility and success. This is the myth associated with the quote everyone misattributes to the Dalai Lama. Let me read the full quote to you. The plain fact is that the planet does not need more successful people, but it does desperately need more peacemakers, healers, restorers, storytellers, and lovers of every shape and form. It needs people who live well in their places. It needs people of moral courage willing to join the fight to make the world habitable and humane. And these needs have little to do with success as our culture has defined it. And that's the main point, I think. Success as our culture has defined it. I can tell you that when I ask students why they are in college, they almost always answer, to get a good paying job. Fair enough. But I always wonder, does this mean that education is just job training? Because if it is, then why the hell do we force students to take on tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars of student loan debt? If companies and corporations just want people who are sufficiently trained so they can continue operations, then let them pay for it. The idea that education and success are tied to jobs is endemic. As a faculty member, I can tell you that what drives colleges is the idea of student success, which is almost always defined in terms of employment. I mean, okay, sometimes ideas of character and civic responsibility are added to college mission statements, but let's be honest. When administrators measure success, they measure how many students find employment after graduation. Now, true, community colleges will also consider transfer rates to four-year institutions, but those four-year institutions typically measure success by employment. I've sat in professional development sessions and faculty meetings where student success is discussed ad nauseum, and it is always in the context of employment. Always. And I always want to raise my hand and ask, have you not noticed that the planet is on fire? Shouldn't student success include helping students to live well in a radically changed and radically changing world due to climate change? I believe that if we don't address this, then we are failing our students and in no way imaginable contributing to their success. Instead of success, I propose we focus on flourishing. We need to educate students in a way that allows them to flourish in their lives, which can include employment, but entails so much more. And finally, myth number 6 is that our culture represents the pinnacle of human achievement. Okay, yes, we have been to the moon, and we really have been to the moon. We have taken pictures of galaxies from the beginning of time. More people are being fed than ever before. All good things. But can we really say that a culture that is driving the 6th mass extinction event and has created a climate and ecological emergency that could potentially lead to the extinction of the human species is really the pinnacle of human achievement? Really? We've convinced ourselves that capitalism has created or is in the process of creating a utopia. It hasn't. Indeed, I'd say the opposite is true. Neoliberal capitalism is ecocidal and further has driven war, deepened class divisions with poverty for the many and wealth for the very, very few, and contributes to a mental health crisis where rates of depression and anxiety continue to rise. This seems to be a feature of it. As Henry David Thoreau noted over 150 years ago, writing at the time that industrialization was first starting and radically changing the face of the continent and the character of the nation, he wrote, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." I believe this still rings true. Also, we confuse capitalism with democracy and freedom. The ability to choose between 23 different kinds of toothpaste does not mean you are free. Indeed, it has been widely noted that democracy is also something of a threatened species, as it is being challenged by a worldwide rising tide of authoritarianism. Genocide, slavery, famine, racism, and injustice all still exist. We are kidding ourselves if we think this is the pinnacle of human achievement. We still have much work to accomplish before we can brag about our accomplishments. So those are the myths of education. But what does Orr think education must be for? To answer this, he offers 6 principles that he argues should drive education. Number 1, all education must be environmental education. For some reason, and this will likely be a topic for another video, humans like to see themselves as separate from nature and, unfortunately, above nature. We create a false dualism between nature and culture when the truth is we are always in nature. This is difficult to see when a student is sitting in a walled classroom that may or may not, probably not, have windows. But yet everything in that room is derived from nature. Everything. Students have a tendency to not think of the raw materials that go into making their $200 sneakers, their backpacks, the junk food they are gorging themselves with, their smartphones, the room itself. It all comes from nature, all of it. We are ecological beings, so that in the places where we live must be the starting point of education. Ecology is the science of interconnection. I think that needs to be the model for all education. Now, this is where I would differ slightly from Orr. Instead of saying that all education must be environmental education, I would say it must be ecological. An education based on ecological principles will not divide knowledge into discrete, independent categories, but will acknowledge the inherent connection of all knowledge. Orr's second principle is that the goal of education is not mastery of subject matter, but mastery of one's person. Orr appeals to the Greek concept of paideia, the root of the word pedagogy, which is the theories and approaches that drive teaching. For the Greeks, education was meant to produce well-rounded, intellectually refined, physically strong, and virtuous citizens. They understood that education should address mind, body, and character. The Greek concept of arete, which is usually translated as excellence, is important to consider as well, as it is connected to the virtues, those character traits that define an excellent character. I think we've lost track of teaching virtue because it may be seen as moralizing, but it isn't. Virtue is necessary for the functioning of a republic, after all. Plato knew this, Aristotle knew this, the Romans knew this, the founders of the United States knew this. If citizens and politicians give in to vice, if they don't aim at mastering their vices, but give in to them, the republic cannot stand. I'd also extend this to the rest of the world. The environmental degradation we see is an externalization of the inner state of humanity. Getting off of fossil fuels is important. Learning how to live well in the places we live is important. Learning how to work with nature rather than against it is important. But if we don't also address our own healing, our own improvement, nothing else will matter. Orr's third principle is that knowledge carries with it the responsibility to see that it is well used in the world. In other words, wisdom is needed, as is a good bit of humility. Orr lists several well-known instances of human-caused disasters, Chernobyl and Love Canal, for example, but also emergencies like ozone depletion, and he could as well have added climate change. And he asks, probably rhetorically, who is responsible? He notes these are all problems of scale and writes, knowledge of how to do vast and risky things has far outrun our ability to use it responsibly. I'm not sure that all things can be used responsibly. It could be that some things just need to be left alone. As I pointed out previously, humans suck at predicting long-term consequences. We need to be very cautious in how we apply knowledge, and that must be included in every pedagogy. Orr's fourth principle is that we cannot say that we know something until we understand the effects of this knowledge on real people and their communities. He uses Youngstown, Ohio as an example. Youngstown is a mostly blue-collar community that Orr argues was devastated by corporate decisions to disinvest in the regional economy. He writes that MBAs educated in the tools of leveraged buyouts, tax breaks, and capital mobility accomplished what no invading army ever could. Youngstown was destroyed on behalf of the bottom line. But the bottom line for society includes other costs, he writes, those of unemployment, crime, higher divorce rates, alcoholism, child abuse, lost savings, and direct lives. Yet MBA programs, departments of economics, rarely, if ever, include the value of good communities. Instead, they privilege efficiency and abstract economic theory over people and communities. We simply cannot base everything on the corporate bottom line. We need to include all stakeholders, not just the shareholders in our economic and business decisions. And by stakeholder, I mean not just humans, but non-human animals as well, and ecosystems. Anything that is affected by business decisions. We can no longer afford to create profit for a very few by extracting resources from communities and the environments in which they are embedded, or externalizing the negative effects on people and animals that had little to no choice in the matter. The fifth principle Orr suggests is to recognize the importance of minute particulars and the power of examples over words. My understanding of minute particulars is to look at specific examples rather than just generalized concepts. Orr notes that students hear a lot about global responsibility, while the colleges and universities they attend are often invested in companies that engage in globally irresponsible activities. For example, many colleges and universities invest in fossil fuel companies, or they sell items in their bookstores that are created by exploitative policies of globalization. It is entirely hypocritical for students to be taught global responsibility when the colleges they attend fail to reflect on how their actions are globally irresponsible. Furthermore, administrators and faculty are role models for students. They need to engage in some serious self-reflection so that they are sure to model integrity rather than hypocrisy, care over carelessness, and mindfulness over mindlessness. Students learn in a variety of ways, and one of the primary ways virtues are taught is through moral exemplars. Telling students to do as I say, not as I do, never works. Lastly, Orr argues that the way learning occurs is just as important as the content of particular courses. Now, lectures are passive and treat students as empty vessels, just waiting to be filled with the professor's knowledge and wisdom. But as Plato observed, education is not like putting sight into blind eyes. Rather, it is a kind of turning. In his allegory of the cave, the slave who has mistaken shadows for reality has to be freed by someone else, and once freed, turn towards the light of knowledge. It is interesting to note, Plato also observes that the freed prisoner prefers the comfort of the shadows and has to be forcibly dragged out of the cave of ignorance. Sometimes I wonder if this best represents students or faculty, but then I realize it probably best represents administration. Granted, lecturing is important. I'll be honest, I love a good lecture. But discussion is also important, as is real-world, hands-on experience. Orr uses the example of dissecting frogs, something most of us had to do in high school biology classes. Do we learn something about frogs by doing this? Of course, but our knowledge is limited. To truly understand frogs, we need to encounter them in their habitats, see how they are interconnected with the plants and waters and lands and other species. Reducing our experiential knowledge of frogs to dead examples is to have incomplete knowledge of frogs. There are many ways of teaching than just lecturing. There is service learning, for example, where students connect concepts with real communities by engaging in volunteer work. I think this would be exceptionally helpful in teaching social justice or environmental justice. The community colleges where I teach as state schools usually don't have the resources to help faculty with these sorts of things. The emphasis seems to be in offering unpaid internships. But again, that seems to be more in line with training, not education. In addition to all of this, Orr also argues that we have to rethink the classroom. He refers to campus architecture as crystallized pedagogy. This makes me think of the high school I attended. It was a new high school for my class, and we were the first to go all 4 years to this new building. I remember one of the main complaints that students had at the time was that it was like a prison. Most of the rooms had no windows, and I remember the walls were painted in specific colors. A teacher once explained that the colors were thought to be conducive to better concentration, therefore better learning. When thinking of how to best educate children, I'd probably put the choice of paint colors pretty low on the list of things to consider. In addition to the campus architecture, I'd say how the student's day is scheduled is also a form of pedagogy. The division of disciplines into discrete pockets of knowledge is probably best expressed by the school bell, as they mark the end of one discipline and the beginning of another. Not only do the bells serve to separate English from chemistry, from social studies, from history, but they also tell students that nothing really needs to be focused on intently for more than an hour, usually less. As Orr notes, students are being taught in various and subtle ways beyond the classroom. Orr ends his essay with a few other suggestions. One is to engage in a campus-wide dialogue about the way the educational institution conducts its business. Personally, I'd like to see the community brought back into the community colleges. The community needs to be more than the business community. And community includes not just the people, not just the local culture, but also the land, or suggest examining resource flows on the campus, assess the ways the campus is causing detrimental harm to the environment, and determine ways in which it can be improved, then weave all of this back into the curriculum. Also, learn how endowments and investments work, and when necessary, disinvest from damaging and degrading businesses. Finally, ecological literacy should be a goal for all students. We cannot continue abstracting ourselves from the environment. The culture-nature divide is illusory, and it is the responsibility of our educational institutions to end this damaging duality. I'd also like to add a suggestion of my own here. Colleges need to quit relying so much on adjunct faculty. Currently, approximately 70% of college faculty, probably a little bit more than that, are adjunct professors, which means they are part-timers. The stereotype of elite college professors being tenured and living in protected ivory towers is simply no longer true. Most college professors have no job security. They are offered little to no benefits. This is one of the main reasons colleges rely on adjuncts. They are cheap. UCLA recently came under criticism for listing an adjunct position with no pay. Hell, you cannot even call that wage slavery. It's just slavery. It is not a livable option. The reliance on adjuncts is a system of exploitation. When professors have to cobble together a living by teaching at a variety of schools, they are unable to devote much time to professional development and have little time to make significant contributions to their disciplines or the institutions where they teach. They are also not able to devote much time to office hours, and they typically don't have offices anyway, which is detrimental to student success. Instead of hiring more vice presidents, deans, managers, and other unnecessary administrators or overpaid sports coaches, colleges need to invest in their faculty and those who have been teaching for them. I guarantee you, they are more important to the offering of education than any administrator or coach could ever dream of being. We have a lot of work to do on many fronts, but addressing our educational system is fundamental because it is fundamental to everything else. So what do you think? What is education for, and how should we go about educating students so that they can live flourishing lives on a flourishing planet? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Also, hit that notification bell so you'll be informed when I upload new content. And please feel free to share this video widely. I'm Nick Mather, and until next time, may you be at peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.